All right, so in this video, we're going to look at the next political ideology in our series on political ideologies of the 19th century. And here we're going to be looking at liberalism and radicalism. So I think what we're going to do in this video is take a look at foundations and definitions. And in the next video, we'll look at some actions taken by liberal and radical groups in order to get their voices heard. So let's just start at the beginning. So in our previous videos, we were looking at conservatism. If conservatism is a reaction to something that happened in the past, to the French Revolution, in action from the past, liberalism make it a capital L, liberalism is a reaction to current events, namely industrialization. So conservatism is mostly seen as something that is reactive. Liberalism is kind of seen as proactive. It's trying to do something in advance of events. It's trying to stay a step ahead rather than focusing on being a step behind. Now, let's define liberalism. So what does liberal mean in the 19th century? So if we're thinking about these words, liberal and conservative, they don't mean the same thing that they meant in the 19th century. In the 19th century, liberal, and I'm going to put that in quotation marks again, liberal was closer to a modern day, like a 20th or 21st century conservative. And just to kind of continue the analogy, a 19th century conservative was like a monarchist. And we don't really see those today. So a 19th century liberal is what we might consider to be a modern day conservative. So what do they want? These early liberals were rich industrial capitalists. And what they wanted to have a voice in government that they lacked. So up to this point, government decision-making was done by rich land-owning elites. So what the liberals wanted to do give a voice in government to all rich people, not just those who had land. Because really, the liberals had more in common with the nobility than they did with the workers. They're both rich. They both want their property rights guaranteed. They just want to have a voice in government too. So what liberal meant was that we're cracking the door open just a little bit wider. Just a bit wider. That's all we're doing. We just want to open the door just a hair to let in these other rich people. These guys were very similar to a lot of Enlightenment figures. So they shared a lot of Enlightenment ideas with like 18th century philosophers. So, for instance, they were very much in favor of protecting property rights. So that would fit in pretty well with guys like Locke or Hobbes. They were also really into free trade. Really anything that would increase their wealth. And that would fit in pretty well with Adam Smith. So these early liberals are basically just regular old Enlightenment philosopher types. They like this stuff. Now, as the 19th century continued, the calls for inclusion expanded. So, as the 19th century went on, more people were added into this idea of a liberal government. And this is because of a new philosophy called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism basically argues that our actions should do the most good for the most people. And so, as we get into the middle and later parts of the 19th century, this idea of utilitarianism is going to influence liberalism. And so, important philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill both argue that the government should provide a minimum level of services to everyone. So, by cracking the door just a little bit wider, we let in people who are arguing that we should open the door even more. In addition, Bentham and Mill are going to argue for things like the abolition of slavery, women's rights, and even go so far as to argue for animal rights. Finally, it's also important to note that liberalism does not equal democracy. They believed that more people should be involved but definitely not everyone. So, their reasoning is this: regular people, and here they mean the workers, are not educated enough to make good decisions, and because they don't own property, they have no stake in the decisions. So if you don't have any property or you don't have any land, the decisions that are made don't necessarily affect you, and so you shouldn't have a say in how those things are decided. And we can see this in maybe the purest form if we look at the American Constitution. So things like the Electoral College and the state legislatures electing senators, both of those things were designed to keep regular people from having a say in the decision making. Because you're not voting for president, you're voting for people who will then vote for the president. You're not voting for senators, you're voting for people who will then vote for senators. Regular people are not smart enough or landed enough, they don't have enough property to have a say. So we're going to let them vote for people who do have a say. We're going to vote for people who are rich and are educated, and we'll let them make the decisions for everyone else. But over time, as the 19th century progresses, the notions of inclusion caused liberal governments to expand these offerings. Basically, we're letting more people have a say. So if we look at liberalism from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century, more and more people are going to be able to vote or voice their concerns. Now, if we look at the more radical side of this, we'll look at radicalism. So radicalism is a more inclusive liberalism. Radicalism believed that all men, so just men, sorry ladies, all men should vote. They also believed in the separation of church and state. Freedom of the press. And of speech. And some believed in the redistribution of property. Now, here's why they're called radicals and not just, extra liberal. Most of these ideas were enacted by the French Revolutionary government. And so across Europe, these ideas were viewed with suspicion. Just because they were connected to the French Revolution. On top of that, they're also called radicals because the rich people who didn't want to share power with the poor people called them radicals in the newspapers. They, meaning the rich people, owned. They just didn't have a way of naming themselves. The rich people named them that because they didn't want them to share power. So, outside of the French Revolution, and we'll talk about French liberalism briefly at the end of these videos on liberalism. Outside of the French Revolution, the most famous group of radicals are called the Chartists. The Chartists are, they were a radical working class political group in the UK in the late 1830s. And they're called Chartists because they published their manifesto called the People's Charter. Which was published in 1838. It had 6 demands, and they're relatively simple demands. Simple to understand, maybe difficult to enact. Basically, they wanted universal manhood suffrage. So all men over the age of 21 should vote. They wanted the secret ballot. Before this, your ballots were public. You voted in public. Removing the property requirement to serve in Parliament, meaning that people who were poor could serve in Parliament. Paying members of Parliament, because the idea here is that this should be your job not just a rich person's hobby. Because so if they don't pay you to be a member of parliament, you have to have money. You have to be rich because you're not getting paid to do that job. So if they pay members of parliament, that means that you can do that job without being independently wealthy. They wanted equal-sized constituencies. So every part of Great Britain would be represented equally, and they wanted annual parliamentary elections. None of those ideas are crazy, and here's the thing: most or all of them, I think the only one that wasn't enacted is the annual parliamentary elections, but they're regular. I think now they're at least every 5 years. Most, if not all, of these demands were eventually granted by liberal governments, meaning that a liberal was in charge of the government. So most of these were all eventually granted by liberal governments, not because they thought they were good ideas. They were good ideas, but that's not why they enacted them. They eventually granted all of these demands to keep the working class people away from the socialists who were asking for similar things and more, but we'll talk about that when we get to talking about socialism. So hopefully at this point you've got a pretty good idea of what liberalism and radicalism are. They're both ideologies that are trying to open the door for more people to have a voice. Liberalism is a little bit slower. They want to crack the door open a little bit at a time, and letting a few more people into the system. Whereas radicals want to open the door and just let everybody in. But they're both similar in that they want to include more people. The difference is how quickly do they want to incorporate those people into the system. So in our next video, we'll look at reforms that were put in place by liberals and also radicals and how they got people onto their side. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.